Hello, everyone. This is your host, Manoj Tandon. Welcome to another episode of Dark Rhino Security, Security Confidential. Today, we are honored to have Christian Espinosa join us. Christian has a tremendous background in cybersecurity, but in addition, we'll talk about that here in a second. You know, he is a best-selling author, a high-performance coach. He is a powerful keynote speaker and the founder and CEO of Blue Goat Cyber, an organization designed to combat cybercrime through technical prowess and emotional intelligence. And we'll get into how those two things come together here shortly as well. So he's the best-selling author of The Smartest Person in the Room. Christian, thank you for joining the show. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on Security Confidential. I appreciate it.
You know, one place that we always love to start, our audience loves to know a little bit about your origin story, because you've been in the Air Force,
Mm-hmm.
And you've got a serial entrepreneur. There's a lot of things here. Can you give us a little bit about your background here, how you started and got where you are today?
Yeah, I'll give a quick synopsis. So I moved from California to Arkansas when I was 12. It's quite the culture shock. And I grew up in extreme poverty with a mother that was addicted to pain meds. So my life was very unstable and chaotic growing up. We lived in a trailer. We're on food stamps and welfare and all that. And I craved stability and safety. So I ended up going to the Air Force Academy. I worked really hard to get out of my environment in Arkansas, and I went to the Air Force Academy. And that gave me stability and safety. And then after that, I was in the military for like 6 years. But then I started getting bored with that and realized that I really don't like safety and stability as much as I thought I did. I thought I wanted it because I didn't have it growing up. But really what I'm passionate about is taking risk, like doing entrepreneurship, doing extreme sports, and things that I didn't have the ability to do it during my childhood. So I kind of decided to start taking risk, and that's how I ended up starting Blue Goat Cyber. And my previous cybersecurity company that I built and sold, I just decided to start taking the risk and going for the things I wanted to do, and kind of abandon that safety and stability and comfort zone of what I was living in for a while, but I realized it wasn't for me.
Christian, what was your motivator that got you to break the cycle? Because you hear about a lot of kids who grow up in that kind of an environment that have a very troubled adult offering, and you've had tremendous success. So was there some catalyst by which that enablement happened, or it was just really inside?
I think for me, I knew inherently that the situation I was in was not a good situation. I mean, my mother, as much as she liked to party and do everything, she wasn't happy. She was unfulfilled, and I knew that there was something more for me. I had to get out of that environment however I could, which is why I focused on academics and got the scholarships. It's also a little bit, I believe, of my competitive nature. A lot of people in my town, and it's a small town in Arkansas, expected me to fail, because of my environment. And, we were in the newspaper a lot for my mom getting arrested and stuff. So I guess to some degree also I wanted to show everybody that I'm more than what you think of me, and I'm capable of much more than most people at that time were thinking.
Well, Christian, you're an inspiration. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening are going to find that, and it's really important. We're grateful that you're so open about your story, and because it is inspirational for other folks who are looking to get into cyber. And we have a lot of diverse people that come into it from diverse backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
And what you just told us proves the point. There's a home for people here in cybersecurity. So getting into the U.S. Air Force Academy, I imagine you weren't there for the cybersecurity program. Were you looking at flying jets, or
Yes.
looking to be a aerospace engineer or mechanical, or what?
Yeah, I saw the movie Top Gun. I know it's Navy, but I became relatively obsessed with becoming a fighter pilot. So that was the reason I went to the Air Force Academy. It just so happened a couple years before I graduated, they started cutting all the pilot slots. So by the time I graduated, I would have had to wait 3 years to 3 or 4 years to even get into pilot training. So I decided to uh, get out of active duty after 6 years. But I majored in electrical engineering at the Air Force Academy, and my career was in communications, which we ended up doing a lot of cybersecurity in the military under
Ah,
communications because that was my fallback career since the pilot thing didn't work out.
hey, I get it. It's a back in the day, I used to get a lot of calls from kids who were at the Air Force Academy to help them out on various projects. I'm an aerospace engineer by training, and I used to work at Cessna Aircraft at one time.
Oh, nice.
And we'd always get some calls. This is in the early '90s, right? So uh, we'd get some calls from out there, and I got a chance to visit that place once. It's a beautiful setting. It's a gorgeous institution. But from your communications work, that's what got you into cyber, then, right? That was your transition into uh, a newfound passion, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I did communications in the military, and one of the things is we have to protect classified networks. So it's basically cybersecurity. We didn't quite call it that back then, but then I knew when I got in the military that cybersecurity was going to be the big thing, the growing field. So I did IT stuff at first, but then I sort of shifted all the way over to cybersecurity a couple years after I separated active duty.
In your current company, have you brought has your experience with what you had in the military, has that carried over into Blue Goat Cyber in terms of its culture, operations, or any of those things? Was it a beneficial experience in that regard?
Yeah, 100%. I'm a big believer in discipline, which is a military. Not everyone's disciplined, but it's something I learned in the military. Teamwork as well, and then the military is big on leadership and leadership development. So I try to apply what I learned from the military and continuously learn how to become a better leader. And the other thing is ownership. I'm a big proponent of ownership, and taking ownership of your life and your team as well. But then also when it goes back to leadership, I think leadership starts with ourselves. We sometimes we forget that, and we try to lead other
Okay.
people. But if we're not leading ourselves properly, that's going to be incongruent, and people can see through that.
You talk about emotional intelligence quite a bit, right? How does that work into a cybersecurity operation? Because when we're thinking cybersecurity, emotional is not something that often comes up into the dialogue, if you will.
Right. Well, I wrote the book, The Smartest Person in the Room, based on my first cybersecurity business. I realized 99% of my problems were because my staff lacked emotional intelligence. They were not because my staff lacked technical skills. And then,
Can you give some examples of that, Christian, please?
yeah, one of my engineers was explaining, for instance, a penetration test report to a client, and he was explaining it super technically. And the client said, indicated that they were not understanding it. So when my engineer was telling me about how this all transpired, he was kind of making fun of the client, saying they just don't get it. They just don't get what we're talking about. And for some reason, that struck me very differently. Probably because it's my company and I funded it, and I have more on the line. I was looking at it through a different lens. But I decided to fix that. I'm like, well, they need to get it. If they're not getting it, then they're not going to become more secure. And it's our job and that engineer's job to make sure they get it, which means altering how we communicate, having some emotional intelligence to realize that they're not getting it. And, our role is to make sure they understand it and really connecting with the client at a different level versus trying to pretend we're intellectually superior to them or to try to intellectually bully people, which I think we see a lot of that in cybersecurity.
Yes, we do. We absolutely do, and there is a complete disconnect, especially between the decision makers and the people who do know what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's been our experience of it, and it's not a disconnect that's come about because either party is disinterested in the topic. It's they're not they don't have a means of connecting onto the same wavelength to start singing from the same hymnal, if you will, right? It seems the decision makers are like, throw tech at it, and the tech guys are, yeah, we'll take more tech and we'll tell you a little bit about what you need, and then we'll go back to our world. And the true solution is not found in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem with our industry as a whole. We often forget that cybersecurity is a support industry. There would be no cybersecurity if there weren't other industries. But sometimes we forget about it and think of the world from our lens only. But the reality is, cybersecurity is about reducing risk to an acceptable level for an organization in alignment with their maturity. And what we often do is we try to implement everything for an organization uh, instead of like doing the things that actually matter, because we forget that organizations have a limited budget and we're there to support the organization. And then when it comes to what you're talking about before, the miscommunication, uh, this is something that I talk about in my book, and I'm a big proponent of. Is the meaning of communication is the response you get. So if you're not getting the budget for cybersecurity, or your client is not understanding what you're telling them, the findings of a report or a test, then the ownership shifts back to you to alter how you communicate. But we often don't do that in cybersecurity. We often just blame the other person, like they don't understand what I'm telling them, or they didn't get this or they didn't get that, versus altering how we communicate. And I think that's the reason a lot of people complain they don't get a budget. They don't communicate cybersecurity in terms of how it affects the business and what the value proposition is for the business, and what the main things are to do versus like trying to do everything. It needs to be communicated more concisely in terms of the audience. And this is often overlooked in cybersecurity.
But Christian, a lot of the engineering teams don't, I mean, on a day-to-day basis, they're not looking at value propositions. They probably don't know how the business is generating revenue. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
Sure.
It's just not their job function. So they're not thinking in those terms that how does this potentially impact our revenue stream or our brand reputation or anything along those lines. How do you change that? How do you bring that intelligence into that group then to get engaged in what they might consider is out of their swim lane?
Yeah, so I worked on that with my first company. That's what I wrote my book about. There's 7 steps in the book. And each of those steps has some unique things. But I think what's ultimately important is having some fundamental people skills and distilling that down to some distinct steps. I think where the challenge is often is we use these terms like emotional intelligence, people skills, soft skills. It doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, especially high IQ or high tech individuals, or highly rationally intelligent individuals. So we have to put it in specific terms. So if I, as example, if I talk about somebody that has can build rapport very well with people very quickly, like what does that actually mean? That means when they enter a room, they smile, they make eye contact with people, they shake their hand, they have, compliment them on their shirt or something. There's specific things you can do to achieve something along the lines of people skills, which we often just say you need to have rapport. And then for someone that's highly rationally intelligent, they don't know what to do with that. So we have to like break it down a little bit deeper. As an example.
Yeah, and how do you hire for that? So I think that's going to pose a challenge. Like when you look at the ads for cybersecurity jobs, they're asking about your certifications, they're asking about experience,
Yes.
they're asking about everything but what you just described. And, and um, I don't think even the fancy AI search engines can assess personality, really. Which is those skills that you're speaking about. How do you find them short of talking to thousands of people and then saying, I'm going to cherry pick out of this? And none of us have the time to do that often when we're hiring.
Right. So I'm in the process of hiring people now, so I'm kind of going through this process. I I don't care about someone's college degree, where they got it. I don't care about their certifications necessarily. The first thing I look at is if they're a good cultural fit. So this means, do they adhere to my core values? Do they have those people skills? Do they have the right personality for the job? Sometimes I'll ask them to do a personality assessment exam, uh, such as the predictive index or like 16 personalities. And if they resist doing that, it's a pretty good sign that they're probably going to be a problem. There'll be a problem later on. So only if they pass those things through a couple people in my company, then will I dive into their technical skills. Of course, I'm going to ask them a little bit about their technical background, but that is not the main deciding factor for me. I feel like people with the right aptitude can learn the technical stuff, but if they show up with a bad attitude or the lack of people skills or the desire not to learn those, then they're not going to be a good fit in my organization. And I know this from years and years and years of hiring people. And when I used to hire based on certifications and degrees and technical skills and all the things that everyone says you should hire on based on, I had lots of bad hires that I had to ultimately get rid of. So then I flipped the script and looked for the cultural fit, the people skills, the core value alignment, all that first. And only if they're a good fit in that area do I look at their technical skills, which are really secondary, in my opinion.
Then you joined us because we're outliers then in the industry. I can tell you that. Because I can tell you here at Dark Rhino in the early days, we went through a whole bunch of people and that cultural fit, brilliant engineers. I mean, there's been some people that who are no longer with us who were brilliant, and I'm sure they've absolutely have had great success,
Mm.
in other companies. But in a small organization like ours, where you're wearing multiple hats, that cultural fit, that ability to have empathy for the client, that
Mm.
ability to communicate, to bring issues to the table, all those things are soft skills that can make the difference between someone renewing with us or not, or someone being comfortable enough to give us a chance to work with them or not. So we've seen a correlation to sales. I don't know. Have you done any more quantitative studies on it and seen a change in sales or retention or anything like that by switching to this model of emotional intelligence of hiring?
Yes, 100%. In my last business, uh, a lot of our clients would be one-off clients before I got the culture correct and the emotional intelligence. Then after that, I would say 30 to 40, probably 35% of the one-time projects became annual contracts because they wanted to continue working with us because they enjoyed working with us. And that's really what it matters. It matters that they want to work with you, that you make them feel appreciated and understood versus we did this great technical job and here's your report. There's a lot more to it than that. And that's the biggest thing I noticed were more of those people that worked with us once became repeat customers and on annual contracts. And I think that and the recurring revenue that resulted helped position my company, my last company, in a better spot and able to sell it.
What resistance did you run into from the market, and how did you overcome it in your current company and your past company? Because I'm just as more out of curiosity, some of the resisting factors from people who are looking to buy cyber, which is still a very technocentric sale, if you will. And you seem like you have a different approach to it a little bit here, Christian.
Yeah, I I don't know if we got a lot of resistance from the end customer when we kind of changed our attitude and our emphasize our culture. Like one of the things I'm not a proponent of, which I try to, and this there's some resistance around this. I think it's mainly because there's a little bit of brainwashing that happens in our industry. Is there's a lot of these like 20-point checklist or 50-point checklist, and certain cybersecurity professionals think every organization, no matter the size or the maturity, should just do everything on that checklist. And I am not a proponent of that, and I get pushback on that from the market because I'm like the checklist should be organized by risk, and if you can only afford to do the 8 things on this checklist 100%, that's better than doing all 50 things if it's a 50-point checklist 5%. So let's focus on these 8 things, get these done, and ignore the rest. Whereas in industry, a lot of people want every single box checked. And I don't think that's realistic for small to medium-sized businesses. We have to understand they don't have an unlimited cybersecurity budget. They don't have the resources. They don't have the know-how. And it's just not feasible based on where they are in their journey as a business. And we often ignore that. And there's a lot of pushback in the industry about my approach to that because I'm not a proponent of these massive frameworks with all these checklists.
Oh, we have a lot of frameworks. We can throw a lot of frameworks your way. And, there's a lot of ways to quantify risk too. But what you're saying rings very true. And it's a great example of where less is more.
Yes.
Right. I mean, we were talking pre-show. I offered you, this is a top 10. I'm like, forget the top 10, man. Just, can you do the top 3? Can you get the top 3? If you can do that, you might be better off than 90% of the people out there, because you'd be surprised how many people don't get that.
Yeah.
How do we change? Go ahead. Sorry, Christian.
Oh, I was going to say, it's interesting. I used to give the analogy that in cybersecurity, we want to teach people right off the bat how to slam dunk, not how to learn how to dribble first. We try to do everything, but we end up doing nothing. We wonder why we're hacked, basically.
And that, you made a comment about extreme sports earlier and just basketball, which I hope is not an extreme sport. But how has your involvement with extreme sports translated into your work in cyber?
I would say 2 ways. Number one is risk. I do a lot of risky extreme sports. I skydive, I climb mountains, I do Ironman triathlon, which is not as risky as the other 2. So risk and then maturity, I would say. Those are the 2 main things, and those tie directly into cybersecurity. With skydiving as example, a lot of people think it's a risky activity. It is, but you can do a lot of things to reduce the risk by being trained properly, by having a reserve parachute, an automatic activation device. So if you're knocked unconscious, it automatically deploys your reserve parachute, wearing a helmet, jumping with the right people, jumping in the right altitude, deploying your parachute at the right altitude. So you can do things to reduce the risk. But in anything I do that's extreme, that involves a team, there's a maturity factor as well. So like with skydiving, you have to have a certain type of license in order to do certain types of jumps and from certain altitudes and over water or over certain hazards. So there's a maturity factor there as well. So we're looking at the risk and the maturity, which are really 2 things we should look in cybersecurity. Same thing with mountaineering. There's certain risks, but with a team, you're not going to be invited to go to team to climb a difficult mountain if you've not already proven yourself. So cybersecurity is all about reducing the risk to an acceptable level based on the organization's maturity. And that's the part that's often forgotten, is that maturity. A small business is going to have a different cybersecurity program, very different than an enterprise level business. But we often try to implement enterprise level things at a small business, which is it's not feasible from a cost perspective, and it doesn't make any sense, basically. So I think those couple things I learned from extreme sports are directly applicable to cybersecurity.
And it's a way of assessing risk. So when I heard you speak about making your outcome more successful, like with jumping, parachuting, you're setting yourself up for success, having that automatic device, having the right people around you, wearing a helmet. There are equivalents and corollaries when you're looking at risk in your organization. And the way you evaluate risk, I would imagine, is not the same from a company that's running 20 stores versus someone that's got a really small operation versus someone that is doing government work in the defense industry, even though they're a small business. There's different risk evaluation models.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a one size fits all approach, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we try to do a one size fits all approach. Like, let's implement this particular framework for every organization we deal with, but that framework may not be applicable.
How much is that is really just stemming from the fact that people, especially in the folks that are running these businesses, just don't have an understanding, a rudimentary understanding of cybersecurity. So what they're trying to do is do the right thing as the best as they can. And the technical people that they're hiring, they don't speak the language in which they think. So they're like, well, let's have a checklist then, and industries are creating these frameworks, but in the end, it's still not making anybody any safer per se.
I agree. And I think a lot, as a business owner, you've got to take some responsibility for understanding cybersecurity. Just like, I'm a business owner, I know accounting, I know sales, I know marketing. I have to learn these things in order to grow my business. Cybersecurity is another area that, as an owner, I think you need to take some ownership over learning that, not to a really detailed level of a degree, but enough to make informed decisions. Because I think what happens is most people associate cybersecurity, at least from my experience when we deal with small to medium-sized businesses, with technology, like a firewall or a spam filter or things like that, which certainly help, but those are like a small component of overall cybersecurity. And I think if you start looking at what's really going to reduce the risk as much for your organization, and if you know what the threat is, which it could be someone doing some sort of business email compromise or trying to get you to wire money to a different account, then the firewall is not going to help. So you have to look at, like, what are the actual threats to my business? Just like we look at them, if I build a business in New Orleans, I probably might assume it's going to flood at some point. So I need to make sure I'm aware of that risk and have the right controls in place. We need to look at the actual cybersecurity risk to our industry and our business as well, and then make the appropriate decisions. Because it's not always technology. Sometimes it's a process. Sometimes it's training your staff. And technology is just actually a small subset of it.
So where does a business owner begin then? How would you advise folks to a 50-person, 100-person company, or even a 200-person company? Where do they begin this exercise if they're going to take a serious step towards being safer?
I think it's important to understand what data you have somebody might want, and then the vectors someone could use to get it, and then also what are common attacks in your industry, like a business email compromise or accounts payable schemes or things like that. Because if you're like a small business that does research and development, you probably have intellectual property. So that's going to be the thing you need to protect the most. If you're a business that works in supply chain for the government, you may have controlled unclassified information. And that's what we need to protect the most. And one way to protect that stuff easier is to minimize the number of systems that data is on. That's the simplest thing. And then you only have to protect a limited number of systems. So we have to look at it a little more holistically than just implementing all these controls. Because I'm a big believer of, if I've got intellectual property as example, I need to control where that is. If it's only on these 4 computers, I can protect those 4 computers much better than I can protect all 200 computers of my organization. So that's one of the first steps, which is often overlooked because we end up with data all over the place and then we try to protect it all over the place, which is not the smartest way of approaching it, in my opinion.
Yeah, we we do. I think most people don't go through that exercise. They're like, well, let's, making an assessment of your asset base
Hmm.
and where what data lies there and where it's stored is paramount. And that doesn't require any tech. That's people getting together in a boardroom and just hashing things out. You know, where do the vulnerabilities lie and what's really worth protecting? Now, you're going to get a lot. One of the things, and we've heard it time and time again, it's a story that just keeps on going, is that small business owners are like, well, man, I ship pipes. Who cares? I mean,
Yeah.
nobody cares. Who wants to get in? But that you might be shipping pipes to organizations that they do want to get into, right? As one example, right? Or you might be procuring restricted materials
Right.
because you're maybe doing cooling systems for the nuclear industry. And I'm just making these hypotheticals up. It's just the generalization that as a small business, we typically don't have any who wants to knock on our door. I think that myth continues to propagate out there. You know,
It does,
can,
and a couple things. Like one, I like to say is know thyself, which you were talking about with your data, and I was talking about the data. You need to know yourself first, and then you need to know the enemy, basically, because we're really at a cyber war. And just because you're a small business doesn't mean you're not going to be a target. It actually means you're more likely to be a target because cyber criminals know you don't have the resources to defend your environment. And things like ransomware and other types of malware propagate uh, not by somebody behind the keyboard. They're automatically propagating to see who has a weakness, and then they take advantage of that weakness and encrypt all your data, for instance, if it's ransomware. And the cyber criminals don't care if they get the money from a 400 person company or a 50 person company. It's just money to them, and their system is set up in
right.
place to facilitate that. So I think we need to know yourself and know what you're up against and what kind of attacks. And the thing is with small businesses, I've read a lot of studies on it because I'm passionate about protecting small businesses. I think they're vital to the economy, but over 60% of small businesses go out of business after a cyber attack. They simply can't recover
Yep.
because they don't have the budget, the overhead, the reserves, anything to like continue on. So it's you know, as an entrepreneur, you put all that sweat and blood and tears into your organization. You want it to like succeed, and the last thing I would think you'd want is a cyber attack to take you out of business.
Absolutely. And you know what? There's another interesting statistic that goes with that, Christian, and that is, people who rely on cybersecurity insurance for the payout. I was surprised to learn it, but apparently the payout from cybersecurity companies only happens about 30% of the time.
Of course, what insurance company wants to pay for the insurance that they can avoid it? And right now, we have a lot of clients that are having difficulty getting cyber insurance because the cyber insurance companies have levied a lot of requirements now before they will even insure you, such as multi-factor authentication, encryption at data at rest and transit, secure backups, and all these things are now in place. And then on top of that, there's a movement in the insurance industry, an additional movement to not pay, because if they claim it's an act of war, like another nation, some sort of criminal in another nation attacked your company and took you offline because of ransomware, then they're not going to pay because it's an act of war. They're going to try to say, which is a clause in most insurance that says they won't pay for the destruction of your environment or your data or your business.
There was a major case in the federal court system that was brought by Merck, was one of the plaintiffs, I believe. And it was to do with the fact that they had a breach from an operation they had in Ukraine, which shut down, and their insurance company decided not to pay it. Now, ultimately, and the claim was that it's an act of war, but From what I understand, where it's settled is that they never settled. The insurance company did pay out something, and the court never rendered a final verdict on whether that is to be considered an act of war or not. I mean, there was some weakness in the position of the insurance company that I guess a settlement was had. Now, I'm going to read that case after we get off here, because now I'm interested in knowing what the synopsis was. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And if Merck is a empire, right? If you're a small
Right.
medium business, you're not going to fight. You don't have the resources to fight your insurer.
That's right. Especially when your
You know,
operations are halted because you got ransomware and you can't generate
I
revenue.
know.
You know. Yes.
What Where does AI play into the future here with defending these businesses? What's changing? What's your vision?
I think this
Say,
year is the last year to learn AI before you become obsolete. Personally, I think every business should be figuring out how to integrate AI into their workflow, into their cyber defense, into anything in their business. Really, I think this is the year we need to. It'll separate the people that adopt AI versus the people that don't. I think this is the last year of that. Um, as far as AI and cybersecurity, it's a double-edged sword because the cyber criminals are using AI. We're using AI to try to defend the attacks, and they're using AI to try to circumvent the AI we're using. So it's really like AI against AI to some degree is where it's going to evolve to in the cyber world. And the interesting thing is, I've done a lot of tests with AI, and I'll have AI write an article, and then I have another AI see if it can detect if AI wrote the article, and it can. But then I tell the original AI to write the article like a human using perplexity and burstiness. That's how humans talk, and to avoid AI detection. So then the AI rewrites the article. I put it back up for the other AI to look at it, and it thinks a human wrote it. So it's like we're trying to program the AI to outsmart the other one, basically. And that's where we're evolving with cybersecurity. I feel like, can I outsmart the defense AI with the offensive AI to get into the environment, basically?
so who is the better robot strategist then? Is that who's going to win the game here? Because it's robot versus robot.
Well, somebody has to program the robot, so it's a lot of as a prompt generation and how we feed the knowledge to the robot and what we tell it to do and how to respond. So yeah, it's about programming the AI to some degree.
If you look at, there have been a lot of, there continue to be people who exploit vulnerabilities in technical systems. But when you look at the evolution of attacks in the industry and these business email compromise or social engineering attacks, they are getting increasingly sophisticated. There was, I know I across my news feed a couple weeks back, there was a fellow in Hong Kong, a banker, who transferred $25 million based on a conversation he had with deep fakes, a conference call he had with deep fakes.
Wow.
You can't make this stuff up. It happened. So think how good the programmers of that AI were that they programmed deep fake senior managers in his organization that told this fellow to transfer $25 million out of the organization.
And he did it. So again, that's
And he did.
it's not always a technical solution, right? Like we were talking about, that would have been a procedural solution. Like if someone asks you to transfer a certain amount of money, you have to physically get so and so signature or something to prevent that. Yes.
That Yes, but in this, look, when we have traded security for convenience, we have, right? Anytime that battle has come up, convenience has won. But there's certain areas where, you know, it maybe the old-fashioned way is not a bad idea. As you rightly pointed out, if you're transferring $25 million, to me, that's a lot of money. And I realize this is apparently a mega bank. They're a money center. So $25 million to them was probably, okay, we do a lot of these. But have some controls in. I can't tell you the number of SMB clients we've had where they almost ended up transferring the funds, not because somebody broke in and took advantage of a vulnerability. The bad actors cased them out, built a profile, learned how their operations work, and then started crafting what looked like very legitimate emails with attached purchase order forms, with the right signatures.
Yes.
And in one instance, it was literally what you stated. The controller walked into the CEO's office and said, "Hey, look, I'll transfer the money this evening. I'll get the $500,000 out. I just haven't had a chance to do it." And his CEO was like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, you asked. There's a purchase order on my desk with your signature on it for $500,000."
Wow. Yeah.
And so it's not. That's the level of sophistication for things like that. The MGM attack with Okta, right? I mean, on the help desk.
Yeah.
That was socially engineered. And MGM's got every control there is in the book.
You would think so. But yeah, the whole scenario you just went through with AI, it can do that a lot more effectively, a lot quicker at a larger scale. So
especially if there's someone like you that knows how to set the prompts up so that it looks like it's a human.
Well, I'm an ethical hacker though, so I'm supposed to be stopping the bad guys.
I know, but there's, the bad guys are quite intelligent. That's the one thing that differentiates us in the cyber industry. They're not your street thugs. These people have very high IQs and are pretty good at what they do.
Yes.
Hey, we're coming up on the hour here, Christian. I wanted to give a chance for you to plug anything you'd like to and let our audience and talk about whatever it is that you want, whatever you'd like our audience to know about your company, about anything, how to reach out to you, all that good stuff, any appearances, whatever.
Yeah, I think I'll give a plug for my latest book. I know we talked about my first book, The Smartest Person in the Room. Here's my latest book. It's The In-Between, Life in the Micro. I just published this, I think in December. So that book has nothing to do with cybersecurity. It's about living in the moment with intentionality. But anyone that finds themselves on a path where they wonder if they're on the right path or they're not feeling fulfilled, I think, or their relationships are suffering, I think it's a good book to check out. The other thing, I live in Phoenix, and we've been talking about cybersecurity quite a bit. In Phoenix, there's Waymo. I don't know if you heard the brand Waymo. It's autonomous cars, and I take them all the time. And I always think about the cybersecurity implications of autonomous cars. And it's interesting because they're only in 3 cities. They're here, I think, San Francisco and Austin. But pretty soon, we'll be living in a world where most everything is autonomous, and cyber attacks are going to be much more serious, because if someone attacks my car and speeds up to 100 and runs into a semi truck, then I can die, obviously. So it's becoming more than stealing your PHI or credit card information.
Right.
Yeah. As far as where to find me, you can find me on my company website, Blue Goat Cyber. We primarily specialize in medical device cybersecurity. So securing medical devices such as surgical robots, drug infusion pumps, pacemakers, things like that from hackers. And if you ever are into F1, I'll be at the Formula One race in Abu Dhabi this year. So maybe I'll see you there. I like Formula One, more risky activities.
We had another business partner that actually went to it a couple of years ago. He had an invite from a company. I've never been, but from what he told me, it was a really, really good time.
Yeah.
He had a very, very good time. And is there any way that they can request a signed copy of the book?
Yeah, for sure. They can reach me through my personal website, christianespinosa.com, and let me know you want a signed copy. I'll be happy to send you a signed copy.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christian. I mean, you've been fantastic. I think we only scratched the surface of what this conversation could be, but appreciate your thoughts and your insights into what is a very important topic.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I'm glad we were able to work out the scheduling.